Good. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Welcome everybody. I assume we are all now in the room. Forgive us for starting just a few minutes late, always technical challenges as there are with these things. Welcome to the Festival of Learning. I don't know if this is your first session or you've already had several. I'm Emma Ackerman. I'm one of the trustees of London Funders and the Funding Strategy Director at the National Lottery Community Fund. We're really excited to have you all here. I think we've got over 50 participants for this session. The festival's intended to bring us together as we are, to reflect and learn and gather insights from last year, but also to serve as a springboard for discussion and action as we sort of move as a community towards sort of renewal and recovery, and think about what more we can do together, really building a movement that positive and progressive change. I, this morning, was at a fantastic session led by Ubeli. Yvonne and Natalie really led the charge. I think, to quote them, Yvonne said, "You need to come to us en masse." So here we are again, en masse, to learn more and to sort of deeply consider how we fund and how we support Black and minoritised communities. Really looking forward to hearing more from Safia and Josh, who I'm now going to hand over to.
Hi there, I am Safia Youssef and I'm the projects intern at Equally Hours, which is a pan-equality membership organisation, and Equally Hours provides the secretariat for the Funders for Race Equality Alliance, who have developed this tool that we were speaking about today. And I'll pass over to Josh now to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh Cockcroft. I work at the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and I've been working with the Funders for Racial Equality Alliance for I think about 2 years now around this auditing project. So very happy to be able to present some results back to you all.
Great, so should we share our presentation if that's possible? Perfect. So yes, this session today is about understanding how your funding is contributing to racial justice and looking specifically at the Funders for Race Equality Alliance Racial Justice Funding Audit. So first of all, who are the Funders for Race Equality Alliance? The Alliance is a group of charitable foundations that are working together to advance race equality in the UK and support a sustained and thriving race equality sector. It does this through 3 objectives: increasing funders' focus on race equality, seeking more and better funding for race equality, with a focus on Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led organisations, and improving meaningful racial representation in foundation leadership and governance. So if we go on to the next slide, perfect. So what is the Racial Justice Funding Audit? As one of our aims is to increase the amount of funding that's allocated to Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and organisations. To achieve this, we need to be able to track how both project funding and core funding changes over time. So we developed a simple, easy to use audit tool to enable funders to analyse their portfolios and see how much of their UK funding is going towards Black, Asian and minority ethnic led organisations, and how much of their funding is contributing to race equality outcomes. This audit gives funders a snapshot of their current portfolio, and it will support greater transparency of current foundation expenditure. It also enables funders to develop targets and strategies to ensure they are properly supporting race equality work. So we have published the results of our first cohort, in which 13 funders participated, and those funders are Barrow Cadbury, Comic Relief, Esme Fairbairn Foundation, John Lyons Charity, Joseph Levi Foundation, JRCT, JRF, Langley Chase, Lloyds Bank Foundation, Bedfordshire and Luton Community Foundation, Paul Hamlin, Smallwood Trust and Trust for London. And we are currently collecting data for our second cohort, which we're hoping to publish at the end of June. And I will pass over now to Josh, who will talk about the methodology of the audit tool.
Thanks, Safia. So the audit, so one of the big challenges in coming up with this, from the starting point, was essentially what is a BME-led organization? What does that really mean? How can we say how much money is going into the BAME sector and how much is not? And so it became essentially quite clear that you couldn't really use just a single there wasn't going to be a yes or no answer to one question. There had to be kind of a couple of different levels to this. So we looked at 4 different questions, and each is scored independently. So you can have any combination of any of these 4 questions. So the first one is whether the grant is going to a BME sector organisation. The second one is whether the funding will benefit BME communities and how it will benefit them. The third is what type of work is the grant supporting? Is it core? Is it project? Is it something else or more specific than that? And then is the project actually addressing root causes of inequality, symptoms, or neither of the above? So I'm just going to talk you through each of these kind of areas in a bit more detail. So whether this was a really knotty one, and we spent quite a lot of time arguing over this particular case, and whether we have it right or not, I'm still not entirely sure. But we essentially came up with two elements around whether you can say whether an organisation is a BAME sector organisation. So both of these must be met in order to say that that's a BAME-led organisation. First of all, is the organisation's mission and purpose to benefit BAME communities or a particular racialised community? Secondly, is the majority of the leadership, so we took half the senior team and the trustee board from the particular minority community the organisation serves. And if it's clear that both are run by and run for, then it is a BAME sector organisation. So that was essentially the definition that we ended up coming up with. There was a lot of discussion, particularly around the percentage levels of like what counts as being representative. Doesn't need to be half, doesn't need to be 75%, doesn't need to be 100%, and this is what we currently settled on for this in the end. So the second question was whether the funding will benefit BAME communities, and we were making a differentiation here because between some projects that may benefit them but do so accidentally, because they are going to benefit a wide variety of people, of which majority may or may not be BAME. So, for example, if you have a project in parts of Birmingham, but it's not necessarily for particular communities who are kind of prevalent in parts of Birmingham, then you would score this as being, yes, the project will benefit BAME communities, but by serendipity, so effectively by chance. The alternative is yes, by design, so the project is being designed and thought through because it's clearly targeted at and designed to benefit those communities. Otherwise, it's a no or unknown to say that no, it's not clear that it's either that there only a very small number of BAME people will benefit, or it's not clear that BAME communities will benefit at all. And the key point is that this is meant to be guided by the intention of the project, not necessarily the quality or the impact or the aims of the organisation. So it's just about what the intention behind the project is. So the third point is what type of work is the grant supporting? So we identified 9 main types of project. Each of this may be specialist or kind of generalist. So for example, service provision. An example of this would be a service provision as a category would include sort of housing for vulnerable women. Research and policy work, by contrast, would be, as it says, researching into intersections of race, poverty, and mental health among new mothers, as a contrast. And then you have campaign advocacy. You have another option, which is core work. There's a range of these things, and this helps you kind of have a better understanding of what kind of work is actually being funded within this. And then we're also then looking at the structure about what. Sorry, and then so here's some further categories around capacity building. So are you looking at capacity building as an individual organisation, or is it about individuals? Is it about community cohesion and understanding? So about events bringing whole communities together, for example. And then finally, you have capital projects, so improving buildings or equipment purchase, cultural offerings and arts, which are hard to categorize under anything else, but obviously have their own purpose and impact. And then, as I say, which unrestricted and core grants. So these options will accommodate most of them. There is an other option as well if you're really stuck and none of these seem quite right, but this captured pretty much all the ones in the order that we had a look at. So one of the other key questions we were asking is whether the grants are looking at tackling the root causes of the inequality or its consequences. So there's a big difference here between whether you're trying to achieve kind of proper structural and systems change, and which are most likely to be campaigning or influencing work. So, for example, a campaign to replace universal credit, or whether you're trying to essentially address the symptoms. So you're trying to deal with the consequence of inequality. So, for example, the provision of alternative education for children, many of whom experience multiple disadvantages. And then otherwise, you've got neither. So the project being designed is not designed to address inequality at all. So, and there isn't meant to be a judgment that one is better than the other. Both are necessary in different, both are necessary in different ways. But it's just another way of dividing up the grants that we were looking at in the sample portfolio. Going on to sampling, so those are the four kind of criteria around the fund to work out kind of how to break down, how to analyse foundations portfolios in terms of their contribution towards racial equity funding. So we weren't asking organisations to audit their entire portfolio. So ESME, for example, has around 800 grants, which are active at any one time. So, and the level of research that would require for us to go and find details about every single trustee and senior management and be able to answer the questions was deemed to be probably too much for what was initially seen as a trial. So the intention was essentially was to ask people to do a sample size. So we used some stats to work out what would give you a statistically significant result from different sizes of portfolio. So if you have 1,000 grants in your portfolio, then you should be doing about 88. If you've got 500, you need to do 81, and this is all to do with kind of thresholds or probability of how representative your a random sample will be from a portfolio. Because the smaller the number of the portfolio, the more consequential and the more weight each individual grant has. So if you have to do more and more of your portfolio, the smaller it is, if that makes sense. So do a statistically significant sample. And so we kind of gave people some guidance on how to do that. Some organisations did choose to do their entire portfolio, and that was kind of their choice. But this was our guidance in terms of sampling. So moving on to the results from cohort 1. So you can see here a pie chart showing the kind of contribution of each individual foundation in terms of the total value of the sample and also the number of grants that have been contributed. So you can see, for example, Barra Cadbury, who I believe actually did their entire portfolio of 9.6 million active grant, 9.6 million worth of active grants, 197 in total, and you can see how that's breaking down here, which is just useful to keep in mind to see how it's split out. So because I mean, it means that things like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which had 27 counts, is proportionally smaller than Esme Fairbairn Foundation. So Esme counts as a larger weighting for this sample and for this analysis. So one of the first questions was, so is it sector-led? So in other words, is it being led by is the leadership team made up of people who are from that particular characteristic or demographic or BAME? And so we we saw from this Mars survey that just under 6% of charities in the sample would have been described as sector-led. So 94% were led by, did not have a majority on the board or senior management who were BAME or from that particular demographic. In answer to the question of whether the mission and purpose of the organisation was to support BAME communities, a 15% were designed to support BAME communities, a substantially higher percentage. And this kind of gives an indication that the history of quite a lot of charities being set up to benefit those communities without necessarily having a leadership representative of those community groups, which is why kind of the combination of these questions become quite important to understand kind of what you're really looking at here. Then you have this question of whether the grant was intended to, oh, I'm so sorry, that's actually the wrong slide, which is my mistake, but the question was whether a grant should be intended to benefit BAME, which is to change the title, my apologies. Whether the grant was intended to benefit BAME communities or not. So this is whether it's designed to or by chance or was not disclosed. So you can see from this that in 55% of the grants audited, it was either not designed to, it wasn't neither, it basically did not benefit particularly BAME groups of any substance. 22% of the grants surveyed were designed to benefit BAME groups, and 19% were deemed to benefit their groups, but weren't specifically designed for that purpose. So it gives you an interesting spread. So in all, you're looking at about 45% of these grants which were meant to benefit BAME groups, either by design or by chance. So is it a BAME-led organization? So if it were to be yes for this, it had to both be sector-led, so you know, yes in that first graph, which knocks out a lot of people. The mission and purpose had to be to support BAME communities, and the purpose of the grant is to support BAME communities by design. So as you can see from it, means that only 5.81% of grants looked at was deemed to be a BAME or were given to BAME organizations. So a substantially small chunk of the pie. And just to recap, only about 5.6 or so organizations, so 5.9% of organizations were led by BAME organizations. So that is one key criteria point that's knocking out a lot of other organizations in here. In terms of looking at so now if you're just concentrating down on those grants which were given to these BAME organizations, to the ones that fit this group, so we're now just looking at that 6% or that 5.8%, you can see how it breaks down by project type. So you can see that the majority of this money, for 44%, or the largest chunk anyway, was going for service provision. And you have other large chunks going for core funding, about 20%, and then campaigning and influencing is the third largest chunk of the pie at 17%. So it gives you some sense of the kind of direction these grants are going in. And in terms of working out what the kind of intention of what the project focus was of the grant, you can see here that 40% were meant to be dealing with the consequences of racism, and whereas 49% were trying to deal with the root causes of the issue. And then you have a small chunk where people weren't entirely sure, and so gave us not sure. So there you go. And I hand over back to Safia for conclusions. Very happy to answer any questions at the end on methodology or the results.
Thank you, Josh. So after completing this audit, we have come to the conclusion that it's a really important tool for funders' accountability, but it requires analysis to be carried out after funding decisions have already been made, rather than being part of routine data collection. So our ambition is that all funders will be able to track and share information about where project funding and core funding is going. We've been working with 360 Giving and the Social Investment Consultancy to create a diversity, equality and inclusion data standard to increase accountability and transparency around funding practice. This new DEI standard takes a broader look at diversity, equality and inclusion. And we view our racial justice audit tool as a complementary tool which can be used alongside the new DEI data standard, but with a more specific focus on racial justice. So we encourage all funders to begin to use the audit tool as a way of understanding how your funding is or is not supporting Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led organisations. And we've had some really promising results as a result of this first cohort. And there have been some significant changes in funder thinking and practice as a result. So firstly, Smallwood Trust, they provided a testimonial for us. And they stated, since becoming members of the Funders for Race Equality Alliance, the audit tool has been instrumental in helping us review our funding portfolio and identify and build on our actions in supporting BME-led women's organisations. You can also see the quote, I think, on the next slide, which states, since using the audit tool, we have made changes to our processes to ensure we assess equitably and recognise the systemic barriers that face the BME-led women's sector. In the past 12 months, our funding for BME-led organisations has increased from 7% to 21% across our portfolio. We're now looking at ways to further embed a racial justice lens within our funding initiatives as new programmes are launched this year. And that was from the Smallwood Trust. Another example is Bedfordshire and Luton Community Foundation. They stated that the Alliance audit tool enabled them to draw out new insights from their grant portfolios. Whilst they're pleased that some of the results, whilst they're pleased with some of their results, they also found some areas concerning. They said, "We know that as funders, it's our responsibility to address systemic barriers and disadvantages BAME communities face. This data allows us to better see issues like the lack of BAME persons in leadership positions, identify groups delivering intentional benefit, and discover whether we as a foundation are addressing root causes or consequences, or neither." Since completing the audit, Bedfordshire Newton Community Foundation have continued to focus on service provision, capital projects, community cohesion, and capacity building grants. But now their portfolio also includes core cost funding, and they're also continuing to discuss ways to support campaigning, advocacy for rights, and fair policy. A third really promising example of changes to thinking and practice is Lloyds Bank Foundation. They said, alongside our wider commitment to equity, diversity and inclusion, the evidence from the audit tool led to changes in our foundation's grant-making approach, including the introduction of a 25% ring-fenced fund in August last year for Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led charities. These findings were also used as a tool to advance organisation-wide conversations and a more targeted approach to work towards becoming an anti-racist funder. And finally, Trust for London. Trust for London said, after using the audit tool to analyse our funding in relation to Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led groups and beneficiaries, we found that 70% of our grant spend goes to projects with Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities as beneficiaries, but a smaller amount, 14%, went to projects that were led by Black, Asian and minority ethnic sector organisations. So as a result, Trust for London are working up plans to make a significant investment to Black, Asian and minority ethnic-led organisations to increase their skills, capacity and policy influencing activities in tackling racial injustice. So that's everything from us, and we will now open the floor to questions.
I've just popped up because there's this expectancy, and I think Milene's going to help with fielding questions, but from what I can see, I'm not sure whether we have any coming through at the moment. So inviting people in, please, to bring some questions. I'm going to pop off because Milene is thankfully here.
Thank you, Emma. Perhaps while we wait for other questions to come in, I can take advantage of my position as London Funders staff team and perhaps ask you both kind of what you want to see from funders going forward in terms of funding Black and minoritized communities. Perhaps Josh or Sophia, you can come in on that one.
So the Alliance has also commissioned work which was on emergency funding that went to the Black and minority ethnic voluntary sector from March to November 2020. And one of the key findings from that was that funders really need to raise their own awareness of what organisations are doing valuable work, and also using infrastructure organisations and community organisations to expand their reach and access communities and organisations that previously they didn't have access to. So those, I think, are two sort of important things that came out of that analysis, but also would help in terms of this audit tool as well.
That's really helpful, Sophia. Josh, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I think that the two things I'd love to see funders doing more, I think, is sharing their data more about their portfolio to understand, get a larger understanding of what's going on in the section and what the kind of cash flows are going to, not just racially led groups, but actually groups led by any discriminated community, marginalized community. But also, I would like to see funders start reviewing their application processes and the way they look at new organizations, because I think part of the problem is that funders are trapped in using their own networks, which can be which which have been flawed, which is part of the problem really. Yeah. And I think people need to take a wider view of what organisations we should be looking to fund.
Definitely, thank you, Josh. And then we've got questions coming in here via the Q&A box. So I'll just start posting those to you, and also for the audience. If you see any of these questions that you also want an answer to, you can press the thumbs up button. We'll try to take the most popular ones. So we've got a first one here on what funders can do better to ensure they're reaching BAME-led organisations specifically.
I would say making the most of infrastructure organisations, and UBLA Initiative is an incredible organisation that have really good connections and also a very trusting relationship with a lot of BAME-led organisations and community and grassroots groups. So yeah, making the most, I think, of infrastructure organisations to then expand your reach to previously unknown organisations.
Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that nothing else really. Very much agree.
Great. And speaking of UBLA, we do have a question here from Radhika on UBLA's Bushka paper called for increased core funding. And is that something you're planning to survey? I know you mentioned it in the presentation, Josh, but yeah, perhaps you want to give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's captured, so it's already kind of captured in the audit data. So I don't think there's a need for an additional survey beyond that. There's also other surveys in the sector about funding styles. It's something that IVAR is particularly hot on, about pushing people to do core funding. And I think that there isn't need for a further survey on whether we are giving core funding or not.
Thank you. Sophia, do you have anything to add to that, or shall I move us on to the next question? Great, so we have another question from Sarah here, which is that many charities we work with do not fit with the audit criteria of BAME-led, i.e. not having more than 50% of board management teams from BAME groups. Many are struggling to recruit, both from these groups, despite being keen to do so. What's your advice? Easy question there for you both.
I can try and have a go at this one. So I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question. So the key issue is that many charities are struggling to recruit from both these groups, despite from both the groups. So I'm not quite sure what both the groups are. I think that's what's tricky.
Sorry, I think what Sarah is referring to here is from both the board and management teams, senior leadership.
Sure. Okay. I mean, so I don't think that the Funders Racial Equality Alliance have an official position on this, so my apologies if I speak out of turn. But from my own point of view, this is something I'm interested on, and I'm on the board of two other charities, one of whom I'm the DEI rep for, and this is particularly on the board issues, and that particularly exercises me, because I think that foundations and charity sector won't see a huge amount of structural changes until we see the makeup of boards really changing. I think that's how we're going to see long-term change in this area. I think in terms of how to recruit, and this is speaking as someone who's literally just gone through a recruitment process, we're trying to do exactly just this. It is hard. I honestly think that I think there are structural difficulties, but because essentially I think there are issues attracting talent who are charities can't basically charity pay is less competitive than elsewhere, so that's certainly an issue in terms of getting the best pool of talent who can go out and choose to do this or other things. I think that's one thing that's considered, which is not something that can really be solved, to be honest. Foundations could choose to pay their staff more, but charities do not have that as a luxury of something they can go about. I think that using recruiters who are good at attracting a diverse slate and making sure that you're doing an open recruitment process and advertising is really key. I mean, a large part of the reason why boards in particular have historically been so male, old, and white is that they recruited through networks. And I think that is something that stranglehold particularly needs to be broken, and good progress has been made on that. But I think that's kind of key thing number one. But I mean, I sympathise with you, Sarah, in this problem, and I think about it on an almost daily basis and have yet to come up to a really, really good answer. But there are recruiters who are good at working in this kind of area And I think that and having some really good equitable recruitment practices is probably the best that one can do at the moment, as far as I can work out.
Thank you, Josh. I do want to try and fit in a couple more questions. Aris is firstly saying thanks for an excellent presentation, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Their question is around terminology. BAME is clearly a term with a lot of feeling attached to it. I heard Josh mention racialized communities during the talk, but it seems that BAME is the wording which FREA has agreed on. Can I ask how much thought went into this decision and why the decision was made to use the term BAME? Sophia, perhaps you want to kick us off with that, and then Josh, you can come in.
So the audit tool started to be developed 2 years ago. So I think that's some important context to keep in mind, because language is constantly changing, and the Alliance is very aware of that evolution of language. So when we published the audit results, we included a section that said we understand that BAME can be considered a catch-all term, and we want to recognise the differences between these different groups. And we consulted the sector at the time when we developed this tool, and that was the term that we used at the time. But part of the Alliance strategy moving forward is that we want to put a big emphasis on language and terminology and speak to the sector themselves about, well, now in 2021, especially after last year's events with Black Lives Matter, what do the sector want to be referred to? And I think a lot of organisations self-identify. So there's a range of terminology and language, but the use of BAME in this audit particularly is a reflection of the time in which it was developed.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just try and say that's exactly the case. BAME was, I think, considered to be the least bad option at that stage. It was fully recognised as not being exactly great. I remember the initial discussion. We spent a very, very long time arguing about it, and no one was particularly happy with where it came out to, but we also couldn't really think of anything better. The terms racialised community was not really a bit of language that had been used very much then. But for the DEI data standard, we're very much using racialised community, and it's all premised around not aggregating groups under acronyms such as BAME.
Great, thank you, Josh. I'll take another question here. So someone said, we're members of 360 Giving. Apart from joining the Alliance and sharing our data on GrantNav, what else can we do to be more open? Do you have any advice for funders on that particular question?
I'll just briefly bang the drum for the DEI data standard, of which I would urge you all to use and then share, and then which will then be published to the 360 Giving standard very soon. So that's what I prompt people to do.
Great. Sophia, do you have anything to add to that? Or are you happy for me to take another question?
Happy for you to take another question.
Perfect. So are you considering opening the audit to non-independent funders?
Currently, our first cohort has mainly been members, but we are encouraging all funders to conduct the audit, because I think it's really important just for all funders to be able to analyse their portfolios and for themselves, not just to capture a snapshot of what their foundation expenditure is at the moment. And we also are hoping that this isn't just a one-time thing, that people do the audit and then that's it. We're hoping that funders will do it on a perhaps annual basis if they have the capacity, but if not, every 2 or 3 years, so that then they can compare how their funding has changed. And especially at the time when funders were collecting their data, it was in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter and COVID. So that is something that's really important in terms of the grants that were captured. So it'd be interesting to see a year from now, 2, 3 years from now, if the same sort of trends are in place from this first cohort.
Thank you, Sophia. Anything else on that, Josh? Great, so just looking through what other questions we have here. Will funders who support mostly core costs and so have less data on which group specifically has been targeted with funds still be able to utilise the audit?
I can probably answer that a bit. So ESME mainly does core and unrestricted funding, but we still found the audit useful. I think it does depend more specifically on what data your organisation collects. But we still found doing the audit an extremely helpful exercise and understanding more about our portfolio and how it segments out in this way.
Great, thank you. And I should also say Josh has very helpfully put his email in the chat, so do reach out if you have any more questions. I hope it's okay for me to say, Josh. I think that's all the questions we've managed to get through on time, which is very good. I'm going to hand over to Emma to close us off. And massive thank you to Sophia and Josh for doing this session at our Festival of Learning. We're very happy to have you. And yeah, over to you, Emma.
Thank you. So thank you, Sophia and Josh. Also, thank you, Mylène. It's been a really interesting session. Just a couple of points, indulgently, that sort of I've been reflecting on. I mean, it's fantastic. We have a tool. We should all use it. Some of us may be more confident to publish and be sort of public facing in our results. Some of us may not, but it is certainly a great self-reflection tool and can move our sort of thinking on. Along with data standards as well, absolutely. It allows us to look in real time at the shape of our funding. I think one of the sort of interesting questions for me, one of the stats that really stood out was around that 5.8% BAME organisations, which leads me to think about who are we not funding, or what is there not in the sector, and therefore what's our role as funders in responding to that? How can we support capacity building? How can we develop leadership, both through our funding, but the ways in which we behave and have relationships with the communities that we fund? So I think there's lots of pause for thought for all of us. Thank you very, very much for everything that you shared today. I assume, Sophia and Josh, that people can look in more detail at the report on Equally Ours website. And yes, use this space or sort of communicate back in with London funders for those who are interested in sort of pursuing more and understanding more about the audit tool itself.
I can actually post in the chat, if that's helpful, the link to the first cohort of results.
Perfect. So have we given people back the gift of time a little bit here? Yes?
A little bit, yeah, 5 minutes, and the sun has not entirely come out, but it stopped raining at least, so that's good. Thank you so much again, also to you, Emma, and yeah, have a good rest of the afternoon.
Enjoy the rest of the festival. I urge you to take part in many more sessions. The ones I've taken part in so far have been absolutely fabulous. And thanks to everyone who's taken part today.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.